Good evening, everyone. Nice to see you all. Thanks for coming out this evening to Schoodic Institute. My name is Mark Barry. I'm the president of Schoodic Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome you this evening. For those of you that may not know us well, we're a nonprofit partner to the National Park Service based right here within the park. Our focus is on advancing ecosystem science and learning for all ages. We have a wide array of programs to help us accomplish that. We work in a lot of partnerships, and we have a fantastic staff here that works in close partnership with the fantastic staff of Acadia National Park, and a lot of great volunteers that help both sides of that equation, some of whom are with us here tonight. I'm not going to talk a lot about our programs. I really encourage you, though, to stay engaged with the Institute, to help spread the word about it to others in the community, to your friends, your neighbors. If you're not already connected with us online, look for our newsletter on our website, which is schoodicinstitute.org, and it's really easy to subscribe there. I will mention just our next opportunity, which is a brown bag lunch tomorrow. So if you are free in the middle of the day tomorrow, we have a talk by DJ Schmidt, who's here tonight as well, about the ecology of fly fishing. And should be very interesting, and he's going to have a number of props to support that talk and that conversation, and it's just across the hall in this building. I do also want to mention, if you didn't see it or didn't have a chance to understand it on your way through, take a few minutes to enjoy the art that's hanging out here in the lobby. That's by Duncan Martin. He did 58 works in 58 national parks. They're not all here, but he did a fantastic talk for us, and the exhibit will be up through the end of the month. And so there are opportunities to bring others back who might have an interest in that as well. With that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker tonight. From our own staff, new to our staff about 3 months ago, Dr. Nick Fisichelli. And Nick is our Forest Ecology Program Director. We were fortunate to attract him from his previous position, which was with the Climate Change Response Program for the National Park Service at the national level, based in Fort Collins. And several of us got to meet and work with Nick for the first time last fall when he came to help Acadia National Park do scenario planning to help understand and anticipate the types of changes that could occur under climate change that will affect the full range of Acadia's resources. And fortunately, for all of us, I think, Acadia's entire management team, all of their senior personnel, engaged deeply in that process last fall, really setting a good model for the type of engagement by leadership that we'll need to solve some of these challenges. Prior to that, Nick had worked in a couple of national parks early in his career. He received his PhD in forest ecology at the University of Minnesota and did a Fulbright fellowship in Germany. And I will let him give his talk about his work here in Acadia National Park. So Nick, thank you.
Great, thank you, Mark, and thanks everybody for coming out this evening. I'm excited to give you guys a talk today, and just sort of I see it as an introductory talk here. It's my first one in this room as a Schoodic employee, and so we'll talk sort of broadly about forests, and we'll start at a global view. I don't think we can go much larger than that, and then we'll start filtering down to the local area and thinking about down east forests and some of the major trees in our forests. And then finally, just thinking a little bit about forest change and the techniques for assessing how our forests may change in the future. So starting again at that global perspective, this is a great map that the FAO put together of forest cover on the planet. And it's a fairly generous definition here of forest, anything greater than 10% tree cover. So fairly generous, but still it's, I think, interesting to see where the forests are actually located. And there are roughly, give or take, 10 billion acres of forest on the planet. And billion with a B. And so it sounds like a lot of forest. And when you realize that right now there are about over 7 billion people on the planet, it works out to about 1.3 acres per person. So when you really think about it, that's not a lot of forest to support a planet of 7 billion people. And the forest, the largest area is in Russia, and then Canada is the second most forest cover. Brazil is third, and then the U.S. is just off the medal podium in fourth place. It's the Olympics right now, so I thought that was appropriate. And China is in fifth for total area of forest. And really, for a forest, you can break these into three major biomes on the planet. There's boreal forest, temperate forest, and tropical forest. So boreal forest is really what you think of in Alaska and Canada, as well as from Scandinavia all the way across Asia to Siberia, is that classic boreal forest that you think of that's dominated by spruce and fir and some pine species. These are very cold forests, cold adapted species. And then the temperate forests, especially in eastern North America, most of Europe, and then much of Southeast Asia, these temperate forests, think of them typically having lots of hardwood species, oaks and maples. And then finally are the tropical forests, so really right along the equator in South America, Africa, as well as in some of the islands in the South Pacific, are where you really find these tropical forests, the ones you think of being highly diverse, lots of different tree species. So common tree species are rare, and rare tree species are common in these tropical forests. And it's interesting, especially the boreal and temperate forests are very similar across the globe. And as Mark mentioned, I'd done some work in Germany, and specifically because I wanted to look at forests that were similar to what we have here in the eastern US, where there are maples and oaks, spruce and fir and pine, and you find very, very similar forest types in Europe. And the same with actually in China, many of the same genera, same genuses of species in these different forests. And with some notable differences, the temperate forests in China didn't experience glaciers during the last ice ages, and so they're actually more diverse. They have more species than forests in the eastern U.S. and especially in Europe. In Europe, the major mountain ranges, they run east-west. You think of the Pyrenees and the Alps. And so they formed major barriers for tree species migration as the ice ages set on and glaciers expanded on the landscape and trees tried to move south. Many species sort of hit that barrier of the Pyrenees and the Alps. And it's one of the reasons that there aren't hemlocks, for example, or tulip trees, or even hickories in Europe. They had all gone extinct during past ice ages. Whereas here, at least in the eastern U.S., the Appalachian Mountains run north-south, so they don't really create that barrier for tree migration. So species have been able to more easily move north and south. Last thing I'll mention on global forests, about 13% of the forests are in protected areas or have a protected status, such as a national park status, Acadia's forests. So 13%. And about 7% are plantation forests, so forests that people have actively gone out to plant trees. And over the last decade or so, the forest area has been relatively stable in the temperate and boreal forests as far as the area of forest. The most deforestation continues to be in tropical forests. The U.S. hasn't seen a major change in forest area in the last couple of decades. And in fact, China has actually shown the the largest increase in forest area. They have some major reforestation or afforestation efforts. So trying to plant forests and trees in areas that actually didn't have forest in the past. And they're having varying success with some of those efforts. Some of these places are really just too dry or nutrient-poor soils to really be effective. But there's been quite a campaign there to increase the amount of forest. And coming down to a finer scale here, looking at the lower 48, and here the green shading is, it's above ground woody biomass. You can think of this really as just areas of forest, and the darker the green, the higher the amount of woody biomass. So some of these forests, especially on the west coast, are the darkest green color. But one thing you can see here really is that there's a nice clean split between eastern forests and western forests. And Alaska and Hawaii would be included in western forests. About 55% of our forests are in the eastern U.S. and 45% in the west. And this creates a nice division here and barrier. So you generally have very different species in the west than you do in the east, with a few notable exceptions. One, I think, interesting one is aspen. Trembling aspen, which we have here in Maine, is also the aspen species that you would find in Colorado or in Utah that create the great fall foliage display out there. And the way that species has gotten over there is actually it's gone up and around and come down. So it's really a cold adapted boreal species. So it's found across the boreal forest, and then it comes down the highest elevation mountain ranges and is found out west. And these are all these ecoregions. They're not a new attempt at states or congressional districts, but these are just some of the ecoregions that were used in this map. Okay, and then looking at forest cover, which is always interesting for Maine, and most of you probably know this, Maine has the highest forest cover, the percent of total land area of any state in the country. It's roughly 89% of the land area is forest in Maine. And the second highest is New Hampshire, just a few percentages below that. And then I think I was curious. I looked at the lowest percent is actually North Dakota. It's only about 1% of the land area is forest, so it's lagging behind a bit. If you look at it by just total amount of forest area, then the big states have the most: Alaska, then Texas, then California. Now filtering down to New England. Here we see the forest types in this map for the 6 states, and starting in the south, you see the blues, light and dark blues. These are these oak pine and oak hickory forests, especially in Connecticut. And then you get some of these more red colors, or some of the pine hemlock forests. And then, especially in Vermont, you find the orange color. These are the northern hardwood forests, especially that have lots of sugar maple. That's why Vermont is the sugar maple capital of the U.S., because there's so much of its land area that has sugar maple, and thus lots of sugar bushes. And then further north, you see more of the yellows and green colors here. And these are, the yellow is aspen and paper birch forest, and then the green is the spruce and fir forests. These more classic northern woods, cold adapted tree species. And then getting even now down to the down east coast, and these are ecoregions. EPA is level 4 ecoregion that you see here. Sorry, it's a little blurry, but the outline of it here. And this was research from a colleague, Matt Dovnik, at the Harvard Forest. And I think in his research, he omitted islands, so that's why MDI'd blank in this. It's otherwise, I felt a good study to use here. But you see, so for down East Coast here, you see again lots of the greens and yellows, the spruce fir forest in green, and a little bit of the aspen, paper birch, and then some of that northern hardwood as well. These are the main forest types that we find here. So then looking at actually the tree species now within these down east forests. And so these, on the x-axis here, you have basal area. So this is one measure of the dominance or relative dominance of these tree species. So the higher the basal area, the more dominant these tree species are on the landscape. And then here are some of the more common species that we find here. And this study used three different methods for estimating the abundance of these species, which is why you see the different colored circles. But so a few different birches: gray birch, yellow birch, paper birch. Of course, three different spruce species: black spruce, white spruce, red spruce, and then a few other species: white pine, eastern hemlock. And interestingly, three species really dominate the down east coast forests. And these are red maple, red spruce, and balsam fir. And these species are really common in our forests, and so I thought I would highlight those species here just briefly. So the first, red spruce, Picea rubens. It's in the pine family. It has really a broad conical-shaped canopy, and it's spruces have needles that generally have a sharp point to them, and if you pull off a needle, you can roll it in your fingers. It's four-sided. It's one way you think about the spruce is the spiteful spruce because they have those sharp needles. And then they also have these sort of classic egg-shaped cones. They're about 1.5 inches long. They dangle from the twigs, and you find them often on the forest floor. So this is the red spruce. And it's really, it's a species that's great habitat for a lot of mammals and birds, and especially for warblers. The study was done actually back in the 50s using spruce to examine the habitat, and it's called the resource partitioning by warblers. There's all these warbler species that, as a forest ecologist, I can't identify any of them. They all sort of look the same to me. They're very hard to spot, especially up in the forest canopy. But there are these several species of warblers: the Cape May, yellow-rumped, black-throated green, blackburnian, and bay-breasted, that are really similar species. They're similar size. They eat similar things, and so there are really questions: well, how do these species all coexist? Why doesn't one just dominate and exclude the others from the forest? And so Robert MacArthur did this work actually here in Acadia National Park, and thanks to the great canopies of these spruce trees, was able to examine how these species basically divide up the canopy of a spruce and end up feeding in different areas of the tree. And so that the Cape May warbler tends here, the sort of the black areas where they tend to feed. And so really at the very top of the tree, in the outer branches in the top of the tree is where they tend to focus, which is one of the reasons I've never seen one, because they are really difficult to spot. In comparison, the yellow-rumped warbler tends to hang out in the lower part of the tree and all the lower branches and lower canopy. And so that's the species that I'm actually able to see a fair amount. So this is just some interesting research that was done, and just showing how these tree species and characteristics about the tree species, this broad canopy is really important for these warblers. their feeding and for their persistence and diversity of species in these forests. All right, the second tree I'll mention, balsam fir, Abies balsamea. This is one of the true firs, and it has really this very narrow crown to it, much narrower than the red spruce has. And it has dark green needles that are flat, so you can't roll them in your fingers like you can the spruces. And they tend to be blunt tipped as well, so they're not as spiky when you touch them. So they are the friendly spruces as opposed to the friendly firs as opposed to the spiteful spruces. And then the other important sort of diagnostic characteristic are the cones on balsam fir. And what's true with all of the true firs are that the cones stand up on the branches, so they don't hang down. And often they can be hard to observe because, kind of like the Cape May warbler, they're way up in the canopy of the tree. So if you're especially hiking on a steep trail on a mountainside, you may be able to get a better vantage, better view of these cones on some of the trees below you. But this is really classic fir with the cones that stand straight up. And the other thing with fir cones is that you very rarely ever find a fir cone on the forest floor. And that's because they don't usually fall off intact. What they actually do is that they disintegrate on the tree. Instead of just the cones opening and the seeds being dispersed, the cones themselves basically just shatter and all the scales fall off and the seeds are dispersed then. And so you can see just the central axis of the cone is all that's remaining. You can see here one that's only about halfway disintegrated. So it's not often you find the cones on the forest floor because that's not how they disperse. You will find some really right now because the red squirrels are busy collecting the cones. And so they'll go up in a tree and they'll cut them off and throw them down. And so you may find one right now if you're lucky to be able to actually get a look at an intact cone. And usually if you pick it up, there may be a squirrel that will chatter at you as you're looking at it because he's trying to collect all of those. And in comparison, the red spruce, again, have these cones that dangle rather than fir with the cones that stand upright. And the one other thing with balsam fir, you may have one of these in your house during the holidays. It is one of the most popular holiday trees. And this fir and some of the other fir species has good needle retention. They smell really good. And again, they have those nice blunt tip needles, so you don't hurt yourself when you're decorating your tree. The third final species I'll talk about, red maple, Acer rubrum. This is in the maple family, deciduous broadleaf species. Has these really, the classic fall foliage is the first thing that most people think about with this tree. And anywhere from yellow to really bright red foliage in the fall. And these really typically have 3 lobes to the leaf. Sometimes it has more 5 rather than 3. And it has teeth on the margin of the leaf, whereas sugar maple, we'll look at in the next slide, has entire margins. And one of the things, red maple, it's sort of this eternal optimist. It flowers really early in the spring, before it even really seems like spring is on its way. And it's one of those first species to add a little bit of color when it's sort of drab and dreary outside. You see here these are the male flowers on red maple. So really early in spring, it's already out there and ready to start a new year, sort of optimistic or proactive. Things are going to be good this year. It's going to be able to produce some seeds. These samaras are the seeds, these winged seeds. Or technically, they're a samaroid schizocarp. If you want to impress a friend at a party, they produce these seeds also very early in spring and disperse them by late June or so, typically, and then the seeds also then germinate very rapidly, all in the same year. So before summer is even half over, the tree is already flowered and it's fruited, and the new generation is already attempting to establish in the forest understory. It's a species that really gets a lot done in a short period of time in spring. So again, this is the red maple, and it's in some ways it's sort of the Rodney Dangerfield of maples, that it doesn't get a lot of respect. And so everybody knows this flag and the tree on this flag, the sugar maple, which sort of gets all of the glory. It produces better tasting syrup, it has higher value timber, it's longer lived, it's more shade tolerant. It's a species that we think of more, even though red maple is one that's really everywhere when you look. There's lots of red maple out there, and I think we deserve to give red maple another look. I don't think that looks too bad. But it's a species that's very common on our landscape. And so one last thing with maples, and I just sort of discovered this the other day. So there's the rival of the Boston Bruins in the Eastern Conference, the Toronto Maple Leafs. And I thought it was great that this team, they're taking on a maple leaf as their logo. And early on, it was actually the red maple. And I thought, well, that's pretty cool. And turns out over time, look, between 1967 and then just after that, they changed their allegiance here to sugar maple from red maple, which I thought, as a forest ecologist, I can't understand this. That it would be like the Detroit Lions becoming the Detroit Tigers, which, there already is a team. I don't even know what sport they would be playing anymore. So I found this to be really interesting. And so I thought to myself, you know what? When was the last time that the Maple Leafs won the Stanley Cup? This is true. 1967, the last time they won the Stanley Cup. So I wonder, we being Red Sox fans, we know about the curse of the Bambino. So I don't know, I don't follow too much hockey. I wonder if there's a curse of the red maple. Does anybody talk about this? There could be something to this. All right, I think I've digressed far enough with that one. All right, so that's the forest of today, these species in our woods. And in my research, I like to think about what's the forest of tomorrow. So we know what's out there today. Trees are long-lived, yet forests do change over time, and it can be challenging to assess that change. And so I'd like to dive into some of those different techniques that we can use to assess how our forests might change in the future. And of course, we don't have a DeLorean from Back to the Future to really assess these sorts of things. And there's a great quote here: "It is difficult to make predictions, especially about the future." And this is really true, especially when trying to think about how our forests may change. But I think we still have some tools at our disposal to think about this. And so yes, we don't have a time machine, but we have lots of other tools that we may be able to look at. And I'll just run through these, looking at some other species that may change more rapidly, but be really bellwethers of change for us. And we can also look at the past and past change in forest composition, and then use some computer modeling as well as some observational studies to start getting at this question. So the first one, looking at other species. And of course, trees are long-lived and they stay rooted in place, so they're not really moving around the landscape very, very rapidly. So it can be hard to assess change in forests and where trees are found. But sometimes you can use other species, bellwethers of change. Birds are really sort of a classic group to use as bellwethers of change. And I showed you this figure earlier. These are some of these these bird species that are warblers that are tough to see in the forest canopies, the Cape May and the Blackburnian and the black-throated green, the bay-breasted and the yellow-rumped warblers. And so Robert MacArthur, when he did his work here about 60 years ago, these were the species that he found in the red spruce trees. And this work is being revisited by actually a graduate student, Vic Wheeler, who is a technician for the park, a wildlife biology technician this summer. And he's revisiting this study today. And interestingly, going back out in the field, some of these species really aren't nesting in the park anymore. So that the Cape May, the bay-breasted, even the Blackburnian is not found in the numbers that it was when Robert MacArthur did his study just 60 years ago. And other species are sort of the new cast of characters, so to speak, that are being found in these forests, the American redstart and the common yellowthroat. So there's some new questions there about resource partitioning and these species and how these bird assemblages may be functioning, but also some suggestions about how conditions may be changing and how species are already responding to some of the changes on our landscape. So looking at other species is one great way to assess forest change. Another one is to think about the past and how species responded to past climate change. And so there's been a lot of work, a lot of palynology work, so looking at pollen, taking cores from bogs and lakes, and looking at, and then aging those cores and the sediments in those cores to understand what species were found in the past. And so this is an example. I actually have a little movie that I forgot to queue up, but I will pull that up. So this is just here 21,000 years ago. Here's the big ice sheet covering northern North America, and this happens to be spruce. So you can think of these percentages sort of an abundance of spruce. So the darker the green, the more spruce. And where it's gray to white, there's essentially no spruce in those locations. And we can just look at a movie here. Let's see. So you see here as the 1,000 years tick by, the ice retreats north, and you see the spruce also following it, across the landscape up to the modern period. So we can see, we know a little bit about what the climate was like during these periods, and we can see how spruce responded, and we can think about how, and then look at future conditions and see where spruce might be found. Play it one more time. And a few interesting things. So this is 12,000 years ago. And you can see, for one thing, that looks like Cape Cod on steroids. The Georges Bank is above water at this time. And so you see the ice is retreating, and there's lots of spruce on the landscape, and we would be in this area and here. And then things warm up. And actually about 6,000 years ago was the mid-Holocene warm period. And this was a time that was actually warmer than today. It was warmer and drier in the summer. It was actually still colder in the winter, so it's a little different climate than what we have now, but it was warmer than today, and so you see spruce actually further north than it's found at this point. And so between 4,000 years ago and today, there was actually a cooling. That occurred, and spruce came back down the landscape and to its current position. So you can just look at that in the slide. Sorry, that wasn't so easy to do on two screens. So again, very cold climate about 12,000 years ago. And then we can look at 5,000 years ago. And you can see here, again, 12,000, how the abundance of spruce and how far south it was found. And then 5,000 years ago, during that mid-Holocene warm period, you see that spruce has moved much further north than it is today. And so this worked really at that coarse scale, regional to continental scale. This was what was found. And so especially in interior Maine, there's really no evidence that spruce remained on the landscape here 5,000 years ago, even though today it's such a common species. But there was some work done here more locally, looking at pollen and at bogs here on Schoodic Point, or on the Schoodic Peninsula, as well as some other coastal areas. And they found that some of the areas just a little bit inland certainly looked more like this then, more of that oak and maple forest, this more temperate forest. But there were still some spruce and fir found actually right along the coast, so a suggestion that there was some refugia for these cold-adapted species right along the coast even 5,000 years ago during that mid-Holocene warm period. So in addition to using palynology, using study of pollen in the past, we can also think about using species distribution models, so some of these computer models, and just think about asking, where are species found today in the landscape, and where might those conditions exist in the future? And did it not come out? My other maps didn't show up. I apologize. But here you just see the range of red spruce here in green. It's really this Appalachian species. If you've been down to the Great Smoky Mountains, red spruce, the same spruce we have here, is the one that you find down in the Smokies. It's also in Shenandoah, and then moving up the Appalachians, it's very abundant here in the northern New England, and then in neighboring Canada. Balsam fir, which of course you can't see here, has an interesting distribution from Alberta out here to Newfoundland, and really up to the Hudson's Bay. So it's more of a boreal species that just dips down into very northern part of the U.S. in the Great Lakes region, and then in New England as well. And then red maple is a contrasting distribution. It's very much an eastern temperate species found actually from Florida to Texas up to Minnesota and Maine and then neighboring Canada. So it's has a large distribution in the eastern U.S. But these three species that are the most common abundant species here have very different distributions, and so really are only found growing together in a small part of their ranges. So thinking about where species are found today and then looking at future conditions, we did a study back a couple of years ago. The Forest Service colleagues did the heavy lifting on the modeling aspect here. But we looked at this area, these grid cells that surround Acadia, and looked at habitat suitability for these tree species, and essentially looking at conditions now and the conditions where these species are found to assess how their habitat suitability could change in the future. And so here are the figures that'll show. You have the time on the x-axis. So 1990 are the baseline conditions, and then we'll look at 3 future periods, 2040, 2070, and 2100. And so it's a habitat suitability ratio. So 1 would be the same as the baseline conditions in 1990. If the dots go below the line, it would be a decrease in habitat suitability, and dots above would be an increase. And so what we see for red spruce over time, and this is using 2 different future climate scenarios. One is showing moderate warming, the other showing really extreme warming. In this case, for both of these climate scenarios, you see a decrease in potential habitat suitability for red spruce on this landscape in Maine. And then we look at balsam fir, shows a very similar pattern. In fact, bottoms out a little bit lower than red spruce does by the end of the century. So suggesting potential for decreased habitat suitability for balsam fir in the future as conditions change, as temperatures warm. And then the last one is red maple, which up until the end of the century shows really no change in habitat suitability for this species, which really makes sense given its really large range where it's found in the eastern US, and especially south and west of Maine. And really only at the end of the century, under the more severe climate scenario, do you see some changes there. So this is another way to look at potential changes for forests in the future using these habitat suitability models. And there's lots of different ones out there, and with different complexities. This one includes climate and soil variables, as well as topography and elevation. Other ones are just climate envelope models that just use climate. But they all are trying to get at some of the potential changes that we could see. And finally, the ones that are my favorite are doing some field studies and designed experiments from at one end of the spectrum, doing these growth chamber experiments where you are able to control basically all of the conditions, and you can grow seedlings in these growth chambers where you control the temperature, the precipitation regime, other factors, leaf litter cover, for example, in this study, and then we were able to look at the performance of lots of different seedlings of lots of different species. And one other thing here I'll mention here, a lot of these research projects, I like to look at the seedlings and the saplings. They're sort of the children of the future. They're the individuals that will become the forest overstory in the future. And so there's really this bottleneck stage in development when you're just a little sensitive seedling trying to establish. And mortality rates are very high, and it's challenging growing conditions to establish as a seedling. And so these are really important to understand how conditions are driving the composition of the seedling and sapling layers, because that will influence the future forest overstory. And so we can do that through these growth chamber experiments, which everything is very controlled. It's perhaps the least lifelike or nature-like, but you can control all of the variables and try to really focus on a subset of them. You can also do field experiments. This is an example in Minnesota where we actually warmed forest plots. And so this is a little bit more field condition, and ask similar questions about seedlings and saplings and their performance under somewhat more of a natural setting, but still being able to control some of the variables, in this case, temperature and precipitation. And then finally, the observational field studies, where really just looking at what's actually happening in the field and using some natural gradients, such as temperature gradients from south to north, or in this case here, and this is image of Schoodic Mountain, and here we are here at the tip of Schoodic Peninsula, potentially using some maritime climate gradients to look at species performance across the landscape and understand how species are doing in different locations on this landscape, whether it's more interior, where it's warmer in the summer, or here along the coast where it's a little bit cooler, more maritime in the summer, understanding how species are doing under these conditions, and thus thinking about how conditions will change across the landscape, and thus how our forests may change. So there's lots of different tools out there that we can use to assess our forests, and they all come with limitations and caveats, and there's no one that's really the best tool to use, but rather to try to come at these questions from many different angles and see if we can build consensus on which species may be more vulnerable to changing conditions and which ones may be more likely to persist or even do better in the future under changing conditions. So yes, we can't make these predictions. We can't make really great predictions yet about what the future is going to look like. But it's also important to recognize that we do know more about the future than really any generation in history. And so I think we're compelled to use that information in our conservation work, in our land management, and not just discount the future, but recognize that we understand a lot and that we need to use that information as we're planning and actively managing. And that, sort of to really wrap up here, sort of ties in with what the forest ecology program here at Schoodic is about, and what the Institute itself focuses on. And so there's the science part here. I've been talking about forest ecology. There's also bird and freshwater and ocean ecology work here. And then tying that in really with citizen science and learning and education. And then using that science for conservation to inform management and some of the decision-making processes that park and other land managers are grappling with. And so with that, I will thank you guys for listening to me, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
And we do encourage folks to use the microphone. Put it close to your mouth, please, if you have a question. And I think we're in the front of the room here first.
Yeah, we have some aspen trees on our property. I'm going to guess maybe the diameter would be 3 inches, perhaps 20 to 25 feet tall. Mm-hmm. And some critter has been going up those trees and just tearing the heck out of all the limbs. They've destroyed some of the aspens. And we've got a couple now where something has got up there. What might be doing that?
Yeah, I was going to say porcupine. What time of year are they?
I don't know how a porcupine could stand to be up as high in this tree with the weight of the porcupine.
Yeah, they're surprised.
Yeah,
they're surprisingly acrobatic, for how slow they are and waddling on the ground. It's probably a porcupine. You would, yeah. That would be my best guess, and that sounds like what others think as well.
Thank you.
On your first picture, the bottom of the map had a little bit of forest. Was that boreal forest too, or was it something else?
Let's have a look.
Your first picture of the world.
Okay. One more. This one. In Patagonia? Yeah, it's that's interesting forest down there. It's as you can see, the boreal forest in the north, and there's a huge land mass here for boreal forest in the northern hemisphere. In the southern hemisphere, it's mainly ocean at those latitudes. So there's very little forest that would even be sort of similar to boreal forest, and this is as close as it gets. And there are even different species, Nothophagus, so a species that's not even really related closely to beech. So they're not really considered a boreal forest, but they're about as close to that as you get in the southern hemisphere.
You mentioned near the end about the increase in temperature, what it's going to affect into 2100. And if it's going to get much hotter, are we going to get up here some of the forests that are down south? And is that because of the soil is different, or is that because it's just not the temperature, it's a bunch of other things?
Right, so that is definitely one of the challenges, is that in addition to just temperature changing, you have other factors. The precipitation regime is changing. It has been getting wetter here, but there are some projections that it could eventually even get drier here, especially with warmer temperatures. It doesn't take as much time for things to dry out between rain events. But then you have other factors. There are deer, changes in populations of these herbivores, as well as nitrogen deposition, invasive species, tree pests, all of these things that are really ultimately going to affect which species are able to inhabit these forests. But just really from a climate change temperature standpoint, yes, so some of these species further south that are more warm adapted would likely be the ones that would do well here in the future, assuming that the soil conditions and those other factors allow it to inhabit the sites.
And the second part of that question would be, are they going to mutate? Are they going to mutate these maple and spruce species, etc., up here to live up here? Are they capable of mutating as fast as animals, or are they much slower?
Right, so that's a great question. So evolution is happening all the time. So these species are always changing, and that's a good question. Will they be able to adapt and evolve quickly enough? And given the slow regeneration time of tree species, they seem to be at a disadvantage as far as being able to evolve rapidly enough. But they've been able to track some of the climate change in the past that we saw in the little movie. Granted, that was more at the 1,000-year time scale rather than the 100-year time scale. So there are some concerns there that trees especially will lag behind shifting climates, which brings up then some of those management questions about assisted migration or managed relocation, and whether or not we should be tinkering in forests and trying to actually move species around, which it's a difficult question, and there's a lot of different opinions on that.
Are there any pest or insect populations that are threatening the spruce and the fir?
That's a very good question. Yes, so there are. Spruce budworm is one that probably you guys have heard about. There's right now a fairly large outbreak in Quebec, so just north of the Maine border. And spruce budworm, although it's called spruce budworm, it likes fir more than spruce. It's a native species that has these sort of cyclical outbreaks, and population numbers get sort of above what predators such as the warblers can keep in check. And so sometimes you get these just infestations that roll across the landscape for a few years. And so there are concerns about that coming down into Maine. The last major infestation about 40 years ago didn't really make it to this area in down east Maine, but did cause a lot of mortality further north in the state. So that's one that's still a concern. Then there are a lot of non-native tree pests that are major concerns. There's a balsam woolly adelgid is one. It's a small insect that feeds on balsam fir, and thus causes higher mortality rates for that species. So that's one where balsam fir already is a cold adapted species and is one of the species more vulnerable to climate change. So this may be a case where this tree pest may accelerate its decline potentially.
Before I give you my question, just to the first gentleman, we actually had a albino porcupine eating our aspens out in the field.
What time?
Wow.
It was in the spring.
No, I mean, was it in the evening?
No, we just happened to be walking out, and I saw this. He was just about 10 feet off the ground with white and big eyes.
Wow.
I went in and got my wife to come out and see him. He was kind of scared when he saw him. He didn't really do much, but he was eating aspen for sure. And you can tell that the aspens get all distorted, and then it's really just porcupines that are up there doing that. But my question is, part of with the evolution thing, how long do these three species of trees normally live? Say the spruce, the fir, and the red maple. Are they, compared to say a sugar maple that would live for
Right.
200 years?
Good. That's a great question. The balsam fir would be the shortest lived of those species, and typically 60 to 80 years for a balsam fir. The wood tends to rot, and so it reproduces at a young age. It's very shade tolerant, so its sort of life history strategy, it's able to regenerate in a shady forest understory, grow fairly large, and reproduce at a young age, so it doesn't live long. The red maple typically doesn't live as long as sugar maple, but I'd say in the 100 to 150 year range. And these really vary. You can find some that are much older, other ones that don't live as long. And then the red spruce can be much longer lived, maybe 250 years on a really good protected site. It could live that long.
I'm looking at your world forest map, and I'm thinking about large-scale change. Is there speculation about, I'm trying to think about the progress or the rate of change. I mean, there's sort of one, you kind of think, okay, so over 100 years it changes a little bit at a time, but it's also possible that it could change a whole lot really fast because boreal forest might burn or something like that.
Right.
Could you just talk or speculate a little bit about that?
Mm-hmm. I think that's true, that the change is often messy, and it may not just be a sort of a gradual, graceful transition from one forest type to another. And it's probably often going to involve a disturbance, such as a big windstorm or a disease outbreak that's going to remove the current overstory and then allow other species to establish and form that new canopy. And so it may not be just a very gradual transition, but more episodic, sort of jumps of change in composition over time. And looking at, that's another place where some of the pollen work can be useful to see what are the rates of change in the past. In my previous job, we were working with Apostle Islands National Lake Shore, which is in northern Wisconsin. And sort of similar to here, they have lots of islands as well as mainland sites. And Lake Superior is very cold, just like the Gulf of Maine. And so they really felt that maybe their forests aren't going to change much on their islands. And so we looked at the pollen records to see the rates of change from in forest composition. And it turned out actually the islands, they tended to sort of change in these major jumps. So composition wouldn't change for a while, so several layers of pollen would be very similar, and then all of a sudden there'd be a really huge change in forest composition. And so I think that may happen in many places.
I think we'll actually wrap up there. Nick's been on his feet with us here for a little while and a lot of great questions. I want to thank everyone again for coming, and please join me in thanking Nick again for his talk. There are still some more questions.
Thank you.